Hi, guys. So today in class, we talked about photosynthesis, and we're just going to go over what we did today in class. So photosynthesis is the process that converts solar energy into chemical energy. This is performed by plants, but indirectly or directly, photosynthesis completely nourishes almost all of the living world. Autotrophs are those that sustain themselves without eating anything that has been derived from other organisms. Autotrophs are the producers of the biosphere and produce organic molecules from molecules of carbon dioxide that are breathed out during cellular respiration. Almost all of the plants on Earth are photoautotrophs, which means that they use energy from sunlight to make organic molecules. Photosynthesis occurs in plants, algae, and certain other protists, and some prokaryotes. These organisms feed themselves by creating their own food, and they are feeding most of the living world. So here we see our plants right here, our multicellular algae like seaweed, unicellular protist. We have purple sulfur bacteria right here, and then cyanobacteria, which is a big problem in New England. Heterotrophs are those organisms that must consume their own food by scavenging or hunting for their own food and then consuming it. We are the consumers. We, as in humans, are heterotrophs. We are consumers of the biosphere. And almost all heterotrophs, including humans, depend on photoautotrophs not only for food, but for oxygen as well. The Earth's supply of fossil fuels was formed from the remains of organisms that died hundreds and millions of years ago. In a sense, the fossil fuels represent a storage of solar energy that existed in the distant past. This is a fossil fuel plant. We cannot just suck up the fossil fuel and use it. It does have to be filtered and prepared for us to use. Photosynthesis converts light energy into chemical energy as storing it in food. The chloroplast is the structure similar to and likely evolved from photosynthetic bacteria. The thought is that chloroplasts were absorbed by larger unicellular organisms to eventually work in a symbiotic relationship where both the chloroplast and the bacteria received benefits. The structural organization of these cells allows for the chemical reactions of photosynthesis to take place. Photosynthesis occurs in the chloroplasts. The leaves of most plants is where photosynthesis is taking place. However, leaves of plants are not actually green. It is the chlorophyll inside those leaves as to where the green pigment comes from. In the absence of chlorophyll, we actually see the natural color of these leaves, which we see in New England in the fall. The chloroplasts are found in the mesophyll layer of tissue. It's the interior tissue of a leaf, and each contains anywhere from 30 to 40 chloroplasts. Carbon dioxide and oxygen are able to enter and exit the leaf through a microscopic pore called a stomata. The chlorophyll is inside the membranes of the thylakoids, which are connected sacs inside the chloroplasts. Thylakoids may stack in columns called grana, and the liquid around the thylakoids inside the chloroplast is called the stroma. So here we have our mesophyll layer. We have our chloroplasts, our stomata. Looking closely at one cell, and here is our chloroplast, our thylakoids, and then the stroma around the outside. The photosynthesis equation should look relatively familiar to you because it is just the reverse of the cellular respiration equation. Photosynthesis is a series of complex reactions that can be summarized by the equation 6CO2 plus 12 H2O plus light energy will yield 1 molecule of sugar or glucose, 6 molecules of oxygen, and 6 more water. Chloroplast's job is to split water molecules into their hydrogen and oxygen. They will incorporate their electrons of hydrogen into the sugar molecule in the later steps of photosynthesis and then release oxygen as a byproduct. Here's our reactants and how they split into our products. Photosynthesis reverses the direction of electron transport compared to cellular respiration. Photosynthesis is a redox reaction in which the water molecules get oxidized and the carbon dioxide is reduced. Photosynthesis is an endergonic reaction, meaning that it is storing energy, and the energy boost to do this is provided by the light. So here we have our CO2 becoming reduced and our H2O becoming oxidized. There are 2 stages to photosynthesis, and we can break up the word into the 2 parts. The first is photo. Photo means light. Synthesis means to make. So photosynthesis consists of the light reactions, which is the photo, and then the dark reactions are the Calvin cycle, which is the making part. In the light reactions that occur inside the thylakoids, water molecules get split, oxygen gets released. We have an electron carrier that is very similar to NADH of cellular respiration, except I like to think that this P here means photosynthesis. And we do make ATP through photophosphorylation. The ATP and the NADPH get used in the dark reactions in order to make the glucose sugar. The Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, or that liquid around the thylakoids, to form the sugar from molecules of carbon dioxide using the ATP and NADPH produced in the light reactions. It will take 6 molecules of carbon dioxide to make 1 molecule of sugar. The Calvin cycle begins with carbon fixation, which incorporates carbon dioxide into other organic molecules that are already in the cycle of reactants. Light comes in, water comes in, oxygen comes out. It makes ATP and NADPH, which are used in the Calvin cycle to take carbon dioxide and make a sugar. The light reaction's job is to convert the solar energy to chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. Chloroplasts are the solar-powered chemical factories. Their thylakoid's job is to transform light energy into the chemical energy of ATP and NADPH. Before we can get into the light reactions, we have to know what type of light we're working with. Well, we're looking at electromagnetic energy, which is also called radiation. Wavelengths are the measure of how light travels, and they are the distance between crests of the wave. The type of wavelength and the length of the wavelength that you're looking at determines the type of electromagnetic energy or radiation that you're working with. The electromagnetic spectrum is the entire range of electromagnetic energy or radiation. Visible light is what plants use in order to photosynthesize. That also produces the colors that we see every day. Light behaves as though it consists of discrete particles that are called photons. Here's our visible light spectrum. Chlorophyll will absorb anything but green. Okay, so we have one type of chlorophyll that likes these colors right down here. We have another one that likes reds. The cooler colors, your purples and blues, have higher energy, and shorter wavelengths. Your warm colors, your yellows, oranges, and reds have longer wavelengths and therefore shorter energy. We have plant cells have pigments that are substances that their job is to absorb the visible light. Different pigments absorb different wavelengths. Wavelengths that are not absorbed are reflected or transmitted. This is why leaves appear green, because they are not going to absorb the green wavelength. They are either going to transmit it or reflect it back out into the environment. So here's our spectrum. Green can go through and transmit or reflect outwards. A spectrophotometer measures a pigment's ability to absorb the various wavelengths. This machine sends light through pigments and measures the fraction of light that is transmitted at each wavelength. So scientists used white light, which mimics the sun, in a prism to create our visible light spectrum. They moved the slit to green and noticed that we had a high transmittance. But when they did this with all the other colors, like blue, there was a very low transmission. So they were able to determine that the chlorophyll solution was absorbing most of that blue light. An absorption spectrum is a graph that plots the pigment's light absorption versus its wavelength. Chlorophyll A is the primary chlorophyll inside of leaves. It suggests that violet to blue light and red light works best for photosynthesis. An action spectrum profiles the relative effectiveness of the different wavelengths and radiation driving the process. So here we see an absorption spectrum. Chlorophyll A is this one in this bluish color, spikes around a purpley blue, and then spikes again at red. The green is chlorophyll B, which is another molecule of chlorophyll that is inside leaves, spikes around purpley blue, again at red, and we have something called a carotenoid. The action spectrum of photosynthesis was first demonstrated in 1883 by Theodor Engelmann. He experiments with different types of algae to determine how much oxygen was being produced. He then added the growth of an anaerobic bacteria, which is going to consume that oxygen, to measure the difference in oxygen produced over time. He found that chlorophyll A was the main photosynthetic pigment. There was also chlorophyll B, which broadened the spectrum for the use of photosynthesis, and accessory pigments called carotenoids that absorb the extra light as to not harm the plant. Here is our chlorophyll. When a light pigment absorbs light energy, it goes from a ground state to an excited state, which is very unstable. Naturally, photosynthetic organisms want that unstable site because then they use an electron transport chain to pass that energy down. However, if it is not passed down a series of proteins, the excited electrons fall back to a ground state and give off an afterglow that we call fluorescence. If it is illuminated, the isolated solution of chlorophyll will fluoresce and give off light and heat, which we see here. A photon comes in, it excites this electron. Instead of passing this on to the electron transport chain, we end up with fluorescence.